In the last section, we introduced state into our app component. So we implemented the constructor function, we called super inside of it, and then we initialized state by creating an object with this key value pair of lat, short for latitude. And we initialized the value of latitude to be null. The value of null meant specifically that we don't know what the latitude is just yet, but we will know at some point in time in the future after we get our current position. After creating the state object, we then assign it to the this.state property. So now that it's assigned to this.state, we can freely reference this state object and the properties inside of it from any function inside of our app component. So for example, down inside of my render method where we try to print out our latitude, I could put in right here a set of curly braces because we're going to reference a JavaScript variable, and I'll say this.state.lat. Now, if we save this and refresh the browser right now, it's going to still appear like there's nothing right here because we initialized lat to be null. But very quickly, let's just replace it with some imaginary number. Like I'll say my latitude is now 40. So if I save this, I can now flip back over to my browser, and I'll see that my latitude is 40. All right. And I'm going to replace the 40 now with null. So the general idea is that we might make use of this state property inside of our JSX or other functions inside of our component. So now that we understand how we can initialize our state, and then we have a very rudimentary idea of how to reference it inside of some JSX, the last thing we need to do is to make sure that after we succeed in getting our position, we somehow update this lat property on our state object. Remember, the big key to this thing is that anytime that we update our state object, right here, our component will almost instantly re-render itself. So if we can somehow get our location with getCurrentPosition right here, and then update our state object, our render method should rerun, and we should see a new latitude printed out on the screen. All right, now before we think about having to update our state or anything like that, there's one other little change that I want to make to our class that's kind of unrelated from all this state stuff. The render method inside of a component is going to be called somewhat frequently, or even very, very frequently. We're going to learn more about where to put, or where the best place is to put calls that take some amount of time, like this getCurrentPosition function right here. But for right now, I just want you to understand that we never ever want to start to initialize some work or some request or anything like that from a call in the render method. And the reason for that is that the render method is going to be getting called all the dang time, way more frequently than you would ever imagine. So rather than leaving this getCurrentPosition call inside of here, I'm going to cut it and move it up to my state, or to my constructor, and I can put it right underneath the state call. So now this makes sure that the instant that our app component shows up on the screen, or the instant that we create an instance of it, I should say, we're going to attempt to start to get the user's current location. Then later on, when we call the render method again to update our component, we're not going to accidentally double fetch our current location. Okay, so now we're going to start to focus on somehow making sure that we can update our state object after we get our current location. Remember that the first argument to getCurrentPosition is a callback function. So this right here is a function that will be called at some point in time in the future. Rather than just doing our console log inside of here, I'm going to delete the console log, and I'm going to put a function body in here just so we can very clearly see the code that we're putting in here. So on this line of code right here, I want to take my latitude out of that position object, and I want to use the latitude alone to update my state object. Now, quick reminder, anytime that we want to update our state object, we're going to always use the function setState. So let me show you how we are going to update our state object using setState. Inside this function, I'm going to call this.setState. And I'm going to pass it an object that has the update to state that I want to make. In this case, I want to use the position object and some property in there to update the lat property on my state object. So inside of setState, I'm going to say lat is position, and what was it? I think it was position.coords.latitude. So we'll do position.coords.latitude, like so. And that's it. That's all we have to do. Now, something that I really want you to notice here, to update our state object, we called setState. setState is a function that gets put on our app component automatically when we extended React.component. So you might be kind of noticing here that there's a lot of kind of very specially named properties and functions that you have to memorize inside of these React components. Stuff like the name of the render function is one of them. The constructor function is another. And then right here is an example of a function that you need to memorize. You need to remember that this thing is called setState. Anytime that you want to update your state, you're going to call setState. Now, what I really want to focus on here is that in order to update our state object, we did not, I'm going to put a huge comment here, we did not write something like this.state.lat equals position.coords.latitude. This is bad. This is awful. We never, ever want to do this. We never want to do a direct assignment to our state object. The one single exception to that rule, and I'm trying to be as clear as possible, the one exception to that rule is when we initialize our state inside the constructor function. Let's put a comment here that very specifically spells that out. This is the only time we do direct assignment to this.state. Any other time that we want to change, update, or otherwise manipulate our state property, we are always going to call setState, as opposed to doing direct assignment like this right here. So I'm going to delete that line right there to make sure that I never accidentally run something like that. Okay, so believe it or not, the code that we have right here should be working. It should somehow render our component on the screen, and then after we get our current location, we're going to call this.setState. Remember, anytime that we call setState, right here, anytime that we update our state, it's going to cause our component to instantly re-render. And so once we get our render method called a second time, we should see some latitude appear with our newly fetched state property. All right, so I'm going to save this, and then I'll flip back over to the browser, and we'll see how we're doing. So back over here, I can see that I did in fact get the correct latitude to appear inside of my component. All right, so that's it. That's the first run through of state that we're going to go through. And we're going to go through a ton more uses of state throughout this course. So at this point, if you're at all confused, don't even remotely sweat it, because we're going to get a ton of opportunities to understand exactly what state is. Now, before we start to write any other code, I want to go through a kind of long flow diagram to make sure that you really understand exactly what happened. So let's take a quick pause right here. When we come back to the next section, we're going to walk through the exact series of steps that occurred inside of our component.